The wind was sharp that afternoon, carrying the dry scent of sagebrush and the tang of old pine smoke from some distant hearth. He rode slow, his horse's hooves sinking into the damp soil where the trail dipped into a hollow. The cowboy wasn't heading anywhere in particular. Truth be told, he hadn't had a destination in weeks. That was the way he liked it. No roots, no ties, no one waiting on him, and no one to disappoint. A man could breathe easier that way. But fate, he knew, had a strange way of stepping in when you least expected it. He had just nudged his bay gelding toward a rise, when a sound carried across the valley a small, high voice almost swallowed. By the wind, he reined in, tilting his head. There it was again, sharper this time. Mister, wait. From the scrub oaks, a figure broke into view. A little girl, no more than 7 or 8, came running down the slope. Her hair was a tangle of sun-bleached curls, her feet bare despite the chill. She waved both arms as if afraid he might vanish if she didn't shout loud enough. The cowboy frowned, instinct prickling. A child? Out here? He clicked his tongue, urging the horse forward until she skidded to a stop before him, chest heaving. Please. She gasped, clutching at her side. You gotta help. Our door's busted. Mama can't fix it, and the cold comes in, and she tripped over her words, desperation pouring out faster than she could form them. He looked down at her, taking. In the ragged hem of her dress, the dirt smudged on her cheeks. This wasn't the sort of child who cried wolf for sport. She meant every word. Door, huh? His voice was gravelly, more out of habit than age. That what you came running all this way about? She nodded furiously, her eyes wide and shining. Yes, sir. Won't you come? Please, Mama said. Well, Mama didn't say nothin', but I know she needs it. The cowboy shifted in his saddle, uneasy. A busted door wasn't exactly his problem. He'd fixed plenty in his day, sure, but usually for himself when wind threatened to tear the shack he was holed up in. Taking on other folks' troubles that led to things sticking to a man, things that were hard to shake loose. Yet there was something about the girl, about the way she stood there shivering, her lip trembling but her spine stiff with stubbornness, that cut through his usual defenses. What's your name? Little miss? He asked finally. Annie, she said, catching her breath. Annie Mae. Well, Annie Mae, I reckon I might could look at this door of yours. He swung down from the saddle, boots crunching against the frosted ground. Show me where you live. Relief flashed across her face so fast it nearly broke his chest. In two, she grabbed his hand without hesitation, tugging him toward a narrow path hidden among the trees. He let her lead, his horse trailing behind, snorting now and then as if sensing something was out of the ordinary. The trail wasn't long, but it was steep in places, roots jutting out like bones. Annie moved with the nimbleness of someone who'd traveled it her whole life. The cowboy followed more slowly, his gaze scanning the terrain. This valley wasn't entirely safe. Too many hollows where men could hide. Too many tales of travelers who never made it through. At last, the trees opened into a small clearing, and there it was. A one-room cabin, leaning slightly as if the earth itself had grown tired of holding it up. The roof sagged under years of weather. The door, just as Annie said, hung crooked on its hinges, banging against the frame whenever the wind caught it. See? Annie said, pointing. Mama tries to push a chair against it, but the wind still comes in. She gets so cold. He nodded, but his eyes weren't on the door. They slid to the window, where a curtain fluttered weakly, and for the briefest moment he caught sight of a pale face watching him thin, tired, but still there, behind the glass. Something in his gut shifted. This wasn't just a matter of wood. And nails. All right, he said quietly, more to himself than to Annie. He set his jaw, rolling his shoulders as if settling the weight of an unseen yoke. Let's take a look. Annie beamed, her small hand squeezing his as though sealing some unspoken pact. The cowboy, a man who'd long convinced himself he belonged to no one, felt the first tug of a bond forming, fragile yet undeniable. He knew then that his ride through the valley wasn't going to be as simple as he'd thought. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the wood groaning like it hadn't known care in years. Cold air slipped past him into the cabin, and the cowboy felt Annie tug impatiently at his sleeve. "See, it don't shut right," she said, hurrying to wedge a rickety chair against the frame. The chair wobbled, its legs uneven from wear, hardly keeping the draft at bay. "Mama says it keeps her awake, all that howling wind." The cowboy stepped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. The room smelled of smoke, dry herbs, and something sour beneath it all, sickness lingering like a shadow. His boots thudded against a floor that sagged in places. Boards warped by time and weather. It was a small place, hardly more than 4 walls. To one side, a pot-bellied stove glowed faintly, a fire struggling in its belly. A patched quilt lay crumpled near it, where Annie must have slept on the floor. Against the far wall stood a narrow bed, and on it a woman lay propped on pillows. Her hair, once dark, had thinned and spread in limp strands across her cheeks. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, the kind of pallor that told of long nights with fever and too many days without strength. She turned her head slowly, her eyes clouded, but alert, landing on him. "Mama," Annie whispered, rushing to the bedside. "This man's gonna help. He'll fix the door for us." The cowboy pulled his hat off, out of respect. He dipped his head in greeting. "Ma'am?" The woman's lips twitched as though she wanted to smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Her voice was faint, cracked like dry paper. "Annie's always hoping for miracles." The girl bristled. "It ain't a miracle, Mama. He knows how to fix things, don't you, mister?" He cleared his throat. "I can make a door stand straight enough. Won't take much." The woman studied him, a long silence stretching in the space between them. He shifted under the weight of her gaze. He'd been looked at a lot of ways in his life, with suspicion, with envy, with anger, but this look was something else entirely. It was measuring, searching, almost pleading, though she hadn't said a word yet to ask him for anything. Annie plopped herself down on the edge of the bed, small hands patting her mother's blanket. "Mama, it'll be warmer once he's done. You'll sleep better." The cowboy busied himself examining the door, squatting to test the sagging hinges with his fingers. The wood was split where the nails had worked loose, likely from being slammed too often against the warped frame. It was an easy enough fix if he had proper tools. He glanced around the cabin, no toolbox in sight. Just a hammer with its handle half-cracked lying near the stove. As he worked, he could feel the woman's eyes on him. She didn't speak, only coughed every so often, a raw sound that rattled deep in her chest. Each cough seemed to make Annie press closer to her, her little face tightening with worry she tried hard to hide. "You got a name, mister?" the girl asked suddenly. He tightened the hinge screw with the tip of his knife, avoiding her gaze. "Name don't matter much."
"Folks just call me Cowboy." Annie giggled, though it came out soft. "That ain't no real name."
He allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "Maybe not, but it served me well enough." Behind him, the woman's voice rasped low, almost as if speaking to herself. "A man ridden through don't often stop. Not unless he's looking for something." The words pricked at him. He kept his focus on the task, though his hand slowed. What was he looking for? He'd told himself he was just passing through, nothing more. Yet here he was, kneeling in some stranger's cabin, patching up a door he had no obligation to fix. When he finally leaned back, testing the door, it swung more firmly on its hinges. Still crooked, but steady. It shut with a solid thud now, not the hollow rattle from before. He nodded to himself, satisfied. There, he said, standing. That ought to keep the wind out. Annie clapped her hands, bright as a bird in morning light. See, Mama, I told you. He fixed it. The mother's eyes softened, though exhaustion dragged her lids half closed. She murmured something so faint. He almost missed it. Thank you. The cowboy gave a short nod, but inside, something stirred. Gratitude had been rare in his life, too rare. He meant to step back to collect his horse and ride on. But as he glanced at the frail figure on the bed, at Annie's stubborn hope, the thought of leaving settled wrong in his chest. The cabin felt heavy with silence, with the kind of need that went deeper than a crooked door dot, and for the first time in a long while, the cowboy felt the pull of something stronger than his own restless urge to keep moving. The fire in the stove crackled half-heartedly, a thin flame struggling against the chill that pressed in from the mountains outside. The cowboy stood near it, rubbing his palms together more out of habit than need. He'd faced worse cold on the trail, but here, inside this cabin, the air had a different bite to it, a damp heaviness, thick with the smell of sickness and old wood. Behind him, the woman's breathing filled the silence, shallow and uneven. Every rise of her chest seemed like a battle won, every pause between breaths too long for comfort. Annie sat curled beside her, chattering in a small voice about nothing and everything. The wildflowers she'd picked in spring, the way a raccoon had stolen eggs from their coop, the color the sunset made on the hills. The cowboy listened with half an ear, but his gaze kept drifting to the bed. He'd seen enough men die on cattle drives, in saloons, on the wrong end of a pistol, to recognize the signs. This woman wasn't just ill. She was close to the end of her trail. Annie didn't see it, not fully. Children had a way of looking past the edges of truth, clinging to the pieces they understood. To her, Mama was just tired, needing rest. The cowboy's throat tightened at the thought. You always talk so much, Annie girl, her mama whispered weakly, her hand brushing the child's hair. Don't you wear yourself out? Annie grinned, missing the weariness in her mother's tone. I don't get tired, Mama. I gotta keep you company. The cowboy crouched near the stove, adding another log. The flames licked higher, casting light over the room. He caught the woman's gaze again, her eyes searching his face as if weighing what sort of man he was. He held her stare for a moment, then looked away. He wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer himself. A sudden cough racked her chest, breaking the silence. It was deep, tearing, the kind that left a body shaking long after the sound had gone. Annie sprang up, patting her mother's arm frantically. It's all right, Mama. It's all right, she murmured, though her small hands trembled. The cowboy rose without thinking, poured water from the jug into a cup, and held it out. Annie took it, guiding it to her mother's lips. The woman sipped, but most of it dribbled down her chin. She closed her eyes, exhausted by the effort. He stood over them, feeling useless. A man could mend leather, break a wild horse, fix a door with nothing but a knife and patience. But sickness? Sickness laughed at calloused hands and stubborn grit. The girl turned to him suddenly. She'll get better, won't she? The question hit him square in the chest. Annie's eyes were wide, trusting, demanding reassurance he wasn't sure he could give. His jaw tightened. He thought of all the lies he'd told in his life, some for money, some for survival, some just to keep a fight from starting. But this lie would be different. This one would stick. She's fighting hard, he said at last, his voice low. Real hard. Annie nodded firmly, as though his words confirmed what she already believed. She lay back down beside her mother, resting her head against the quilt. Told you, Mama, you're strong. The cowboy turned away, his hands curling into fists. He hated himself a little for not saying more, for not offering the hope she wanted outright. But he'd seen, too, much death to make promises he couldn't keep. Time passed slowly. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, rattling the patched window. Annie eventually drifted into a light doze, her small body tucked against her mother's side. The woman lay awake, though, her gaze fixed on the ceiling. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice barely above a breath. "You know, stranger, this place wasn't always so quiet. My husband built this cabin with his own 2 hands. Laughed loud enough to scare the birds off when he swung the hammer crooked. Thought we'd raise a family here." The cowboy didn't answer. He stayed by the stove, listening. "He left when Annie was just a babe," she continued. "Said he was going to town for work. Never came back. Guess he found a road easier than this one." She coughed, her voice breaking. "Been just us since then." The cowboy's throat worked, but no words came. He knew the type, the kind of man who couldn't stand the weight of responsibility, who thought the world owed him freedom. He'd lived close to that life himself, always drifting, never rooted. But looking at Annie, the thought of leaving her behind made his stomach twist. The mother's gaze slid to him, heavy with meaning. "You look like a man used to ridden on. Maybe you're different, maybe not. But she—" her voice cracked, eyes wet. "She deserves someone who won't walk away." The cowboy swallowed hard. He opened his mouth, closed it again. He wasn't ready to answer, not yet. But in that moment, with the fire snapping low and the child breathing softly against her mother's side, he knew this wasn't just their silent struggle anymore. It was his too. The cowboy stayed near the door long after the silence settled again. He could hear the faint whistle of the wind pressing against the cabin's patched seams, could feel the draft tugging at his coat even with the hinges now straightened. His work had steadied the door, but it hadn't steadied the deeper things, the things clawing at him as he watched. The child nestled against her mother's failing frame. Annie stirred and sat up after a while, rubbing her eyes. "You fixed." "It real good, mister," she said softly, as if not to wake her mama. She tilted her head, studying him with that clear, unblinking gaze children carried. "You gonna stay till morning?" The cowboy hesitated. That simple question pulled at him like a rope around the chest. He wasn't a man built for staying. For years, he'd made his bed wherever he could under stars, in barns, against the rough planks of half-abandoned line shacks. No one expected him to linger, and he trained himself not to expect it of others. Yet now, in this cabin heavy with sickness and need, the thought of walking out into the night sat wrong in his gut. "We'll see," he muttered finally, tugging at his gloves. "Depends if your mama wants a stranger hanging about." Annie wrinkled her nose. "You don't feel like a stranger. Mama always says strangers bring trouble. You didn't bring trouble, you brought help." He almost chuckled, but it died in his throat when her mother coughed again. He turned, watching her thin body curl against the effort. She opened her eyes and caught his look, and for a moment he felt pinned to the floorboards by the sheer weight of it. "Annie," the woman rasped, her hand reaching out blindly. "Fetch me that quilt from the chair." The girl hopped up to obey, dragging the faded quilt to her mother's side. The cowboy bent then, his rough hands surprisingly careful as he lifted her shoulders so Annie could tuck it beneath. He felt the bones in her back, sharp as fence posts under too little flesh. She gave him the smallest nod of thanks before sinking back into the pillows. "You ride alone," she whispered after a long pause, her eyes still on him. He stiffened, not sure if it was a question or an accusation. "Most times," he said. "Men who ride alone," she murmured, her voice weak but steady. "Don't usually stop for broken doors." He didn't answer. He busied himself near the stove, pretending to fuss with the fire, but her words had slipped under his skin. She was right. He wouldn't have stopped, not usually. Something about the little girl's desperation had lassoed him before he could think twice. When he finally sat back down, the room was quiet except for the crack of burning wood. Annie was humming softly, half lost in drowsiness. Her mother's eyes were still open, though, watching him with a kind of weary knowing. "You'll be ridden on come morning," she said. More statement than question. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. He wanted to say yes, to keep it. Simple. That was what he did. Move on, never put down roots, never tie himself to anyone else's sorrow. But the words wouldn't come, not with Annie's small body curled against her mother's side, not with the woman's eyes begging for something she hadn't yet asked aloud. He cleared his throat, rough as gravel. "We'll see what morning brings." That seemed to satisfy her for now. Her eyes fluttered shut, and soon her breathing evened into a shallow rhythm again. The cowboy leaned back against the wall, folding his arms across his chest. He stared at the door he'd mended, at the flicker of firelight spilling across the floor. He told himself he was only staying the night out of decency, out of respect. But deep down he knew better. Something had shifted the moment that little girl grabbed his hand and begged for help. Something had changed when he carried water to the lips of a dying woman. He was no longer just a drifter passing through. He was tied here now, whether he wanted to admit it or not, and in the quiet of that cabin, with the weight of both gratitude and expectation pressing on him, the cowboy made a decision not spoken, not even fully formed, but solid as stone in his chest. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. The night deepened, pressing against the cabin with a kind of heavy stillness. The cowboy sat near the stove, his hat pulled low over his brow, listening to the fire crackle. Annie had long since drifted to sleep, curled up like a kitten on a pallet near the hearth. The faint rise and fall of her breathing was the only easy sound in the room. Her mother, though, hadn't found rest. He could hear her shifting weakly in bed, hear the occasional hitch of breath that told him she was still awake. At last her voice cut through the silence, thin as thread. "Cowboy." He lifted his head. "Ma'am, come closer, please." He hesitated, then pushed himself up, boots creaking against the floorboards. When he reached her side, he realized how frail she had become. Her hands trembled as she tried to adjust the blanket, and without thinking, he reached down to steady it. Her eyes found his, and this time there was no mistaking the plea in them. "Don't ride out yet. Not tonight. Not tomorrow neither." He shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to answer. He wasn't used to being needed. Folks had always been glad enough to see him go. Her fingers reached for his wrist, curling around it with surprising strength. "She's just a child," she whispered, her voice breaking. "She don't understand what's coming." I can't leave her alone." The cowboy swallowed hard. He had known this moment was coming, had felt it pressing closer all evening, but hearing it aloud cut deeper than he'd expected. "You're stronger than you think," he muttered, though even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. She gave a faint, bitter smile. "Strong don't mean nothin' when your body's already decided it's done. I've felt it for weeks now. Every breath a little shorter, every day a little dimmer. I don't got much left in me." His chest tightened. He thought of Annie asleep by the stove, oblivious, dreaming childish dreams while the world around her shifted like sand beneath her feet. The woman's grip tightened on him. "Promise me," she rasped, each word costing her effort. "Promise me you won't leave her." The cowboy's instinct was to pull back, to tell her he wasn't the man for such things. Promises were heavy. They tied a man down, bound him in ways that spurs and saddles never could. He had spent years dodging that weight, living free because no one expected anything of him. But the woman's eyes burned into his, fierce despite the weakness in her body. And behind that fierceness was fear, not for herself, but for the little girl who clung to her every word. He looked away, his jaw tight. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint hiss of the fire. At last, he exhaled slowly, the sound rough as gravel. I ain't much of a man for promises. But," his voice faltered, then steadied, "I'll see she ain't alone." "You have my word on that." Something eased in her face then. Her hand loosened, sliding back against the quilt. She closed her eyes, and for the first time that night, her breathing smoothed into something close to peace. The cowboy stood there for a long while, watching her chest rise and fall, watching Annie's small body curl tighter under her blanket. His heart felt heavier than his saddle ever had. He returned to his place by the stove, lowering himself onto the chair. His gaze wandered to the door he'd fixed earlier, sturdy now against the wind. It struck him as strange. The girl had begged him for help with a broken door, but what she truly needed was something far more than wood and nails could mend, and he had just bound himself to give it. He leaned back, hat shadowing his eyes, and let out a long breath. "I ain't leaving you," he murmured, though no one but the fire heard him. "Not now. Not ever." Dawn was still far off, but the dark outside had thinned into that strange stillness that comes before morning. The fire in the stove had burned low, its embers glowing faintly red. The cowboy had dozed in the chair, hat tipped forward, when a sound jerked him awake a ragged, uneven breath from the bed. His eyes went straight to her. The woman was struggling, her chest rising in shallow, trembling bursts. Each inhale seemed harder won than the last. The room was quiet but for that sound and the faint scratch of wind outside. "Ma?" Annie's small voice stirred from her pallet near the stove. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, confusion clouding her face as she looked toward the bed. "Mama?" The cowboy rose quickly, crossing to the bedside. The mother's eyes fluttered open, glassy and distant, but when they found Annie, they softened. With a depth of love that words couldn't hold, the girl scrambled up onto the mattress, burrowing against her mother's side. "I'm here, Mama. I'm right here." The woman's hand, frail and trembling, found her daughter's hair. She stroked it weakly, lips moving though no sound came. The cowboy bent closer. "She's listening, ma'am. She hears you." Her eyes flicked to him for the briefest moment, and he saw the truth written there. This was it, the trail's end. His throat tightened, but he nodded, as if granting permission she didn't need but might have been waiting for. She turned her gaze back to Annie, gathering what little strength she had left. Her voice came at last, no louder than a whisper. "My sweet girl, be brave, always be brave." Annie clung tighter, shaking her head fiercely. "Don't talk like that. You're going to get better. The cowboy fixed the door, remember? You'll be warmer now." Her words tumbled out like stones, desperate and fast, trying to build a wall against what was coming. The woman's chest rose again, faltered, rose once more. Each breath rattled like dry leaves. Her eyes never left Annie's face, though tears gathered at the corners. She brushed her thumb across her daughter's cheek, the motion slow and trembling. The cowboy stood helpless beside them, hat in his hands. He'd seen death many times, but never like this, never so quiet, so tender, so cruel. Finally, the mother's breaths grew smaller, like a candle flame shrinking. Her hand, still tangled in Annie's hair, stilled. Her lips parted as though she meant to speak again, but only silence came. "Mama?" Annie's voice broke. She shook her gently, as if that alone could call her back. "Mama, please, don't go to sleep now." The cowboy crouched, laying a steady hand on the girl's shoulder. His voice came low, gravel thick with something softer underneath. "She's gone, Annie Mae." "No." The child shook her head violently, her curls bouncing. "She can't be." She promised, she promised. He gathered her up, pulling her into his arms even as she kicked against him. She was all fight, all grief, her small fists pounding weakly against his chest. But he held her steady, rocking her gently as she sobbed, her cries raw enough to tear at the seams of his heart. He glanced back at the still form on the bed. The mother's face had smoothed, all the pain gone, leaving only a quiet kind of peace. She'd slipped away with her last sight of her child, just as she'd wanted. The cowboy closed his eyes, pressing his chin against Annie's hair. "Ain't leavin' you," he murmured, more promise than comfort. "You hear me, girl? I ain't leavin'." Her cries softened to hiccups, her small body trembling against him. She clutched his shirt in her fists, clinging to him as if he were the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. He stayed there on the floor with her, holding her as the fire burned low and the first gray light of dawn crept at the edges of the window dot when at last Annie's tears gave way to exhausted sleep in his arms. The cowboy lifted his head and looked once more at the woman on the bed. "You can rest now," he said quietly. "I'll carry her the rest of the way." The gray light of morning slid slowly into the cabin, pale and cold, casting long shadows over the wooden floor. The cowboy hadn't slept. He sat in the chair by the stove, Annie curled against his chest, her small hands fisted in his shirt. She was still, but not peaceful. Her breaths hitched now and again, her body shuddering as though grief chased her even in dreams. The cowboy's eyes stayed on the bed. The quilt had slipped to one side, half covering the still form beneath. Death had left the woman's face strangely soft, as though she were resting after a long day's work. He had seen many men die hard, screaming, clawing, bleeding, but this was different, quiet, unforgiving. The weight of her last request sat heavy on him. "Promise me you won't leave her." He shifted in the chair, his muscles stiff from holding Annie through the night. A man like him wasn't meant to make promises. Promises were chains, and chains were something he'd spent his life outrunning. Yet, when her hand had clutched his wrist, when her eyes had burned that plea into him, something in him had bent, and something else had broken. "I ain't leaving you," he whispered now, his lips brushing the top of Annie's tangled hair. The words were quiet, but they felt heavier than lead. Sinking into the marrow of his bones, Annie stirred, blinking gradually. Her eyes found the empty bed first, and realization hit her all over again. She buried her face against him, shoulders trembling. "Hush now," he murmured, rocking her gently. "She's gone on ahead, but I'm still here. You got me." Her voice came muffled, small and cracked. "But you'll leave. Everybody leaves." The cowboy's jaw tightened. That was a wound too deep for any child to carry, and it cut him clean through to hear it said aloud. He lifted her chin, making her meet his gaze. "Listen close, Annie Mae," he said, steady as stone. "I ain't like the ones who left. I gave my word to your mama. I don't break my word." She studied him, searching his face with eyes swollen from crying. "You promise?" He nodded once. "I promise." The girl clung to him tighter, as though those words had anchored her to something solid for the first time in her short life. And in truth, they had anchored him too. For years he had drifted, a man of no place and no purpose beyond the next sunrise. But sitting there with a child's trust pressed against his chest and a dead woman's plea echoing in his mind, he felt the old freedom slip away like smoke on the wind. He was bound now, not by law, not by duty, but by choice. The fire in the stove hissed low, nearly gone. He eased Annie back onto her pallet, tucking the quilt around her shoulders, and stood. His legs were stiff, but his steps were steady as he crossed the room to the bed. He pulled the quilt up to cover the mother fully, smoothing it with a hand that trembled only slightly. "Rest easy," he muttered. "You don't have to worry." No more. When he turned back, Annie was watching him, her eyes wide and glistening. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. He paused, the weight of the moment hanging thick between them. His old life tugged at him, saddlebags waiting, horse ready, the endless trail calling. But that life felt far behind him now, as distant as the horizon he'd once chased. Without question, he crouched beside her, his voice low but sure. Now I take care of you." Her small hand crept out from beneath the quilt and slipped into his. She didn't say a word, but she didn't need to. The bond was sealed. The cowboy straightened, jaw set, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to purpose settle into his bones. It wasn't the kind of life he'd ever planned, but it was the kind of life that had found him, and this time, he wasn't going to turn away. The words had bound him tighter than iron, and he knew, deep down, he wouldn't want to break free. Sun crept over the ridge slow and solemn, its first light spilling across the valley like a benediction. Frost clung to the grass outside the cabin, each blade sparkling as though the earth itself had been laid with silver. The cowboy stood on the hill behind the cabin, his hat pressed against his chest. Before him, a mound of freshly turned earth marked the resting place of Annie's mother. He had dug through the night, the handle of the spade biting into his calloused palms, the cold seeping through his coat. Each shovelful had been a kind of penance, a way of honoring a woman he'd barely known but who had trusted him with her most precious thing. Now, as the sun broke fully over the hills, he bowed his head. "Rest easy, ma'am," he murmured. "I'll see to her." "You got my word." Behind him came the faint crunch of small footsteps. Annie appeared, wrapped in his saddle blanket, the edges trailing in the dirt. She clutched a bunch of wildflowers scraggly, frost-touched things she'd gathered near the creek. "Can I put these here?" she asked softly, her voice still thick from crying. The cowboy nodded. She knelt by the grave, laying the flowers down with careful hands. For a long moment she stayed there, silent, her little shoulders stiff with the effort of being brave. When she rose again, her eyes were red but steady. She looked up at him, not with the pleading of the night before, but with a quiet trust that made his chest ache. "Where do we go now?" she asked. He studied the horizon, the long sweep of land stretching endless in every direction. For most of his life, that sight had meant freedom roads unwritten, places unclaimed. But now it looked different. Now it was a road to somewhere, even if he didn't know the name of the place yet. "First thing," he said, adjusting his hat, "we'll ride into town. Get you something proper to eat. After that, we'll figure the rest as it comes." Annie nodded, as if that was answer enough. Back at the cabin, the cowboy saddled his horse. The gelding stamped and snorted, impatient for the trail. He lifted Annie into the saddle first, her small frame swallowed by his old blanket. She clutched the horn with both hands, looking both nervous and proud to be up so high. "Hold on tight," he told her, swinging up behind. His arms came around her easily, the reins resting loose in his grip. The warmth of her back pressed against him, light as a bird, fragile as glass dot. As they started down the trail, the cabin shrank behind them. The crooked roof, the mended door, the smoke-blackened chimney, soon it would be nothing but a shadow among the trees. Annie twisted in the saddle to glance back one last time. "Goodbye, Mama," she whispered, so soft he almost didn't hear it. The cowboy tightened his hold just slightly, steadying her against the sway of the horse. The valley opened before them, wide and waiting. For the first time in years he felt no itch to outrun it, no hunger for the road's empty promise. His life had been his own until now, but it wasn't anymore. It belonged to the little girl in his arms, to the memory of the woman resting on the hill behind them. He urged the horse into an easy trot, the sun warming their backs as they rode toward the unknown. Annie leaned against him, her small voice rising over the morning breeze. "You ain't leaving me, right?" The cowboy looked down at her, at the stubborn hope shining through her grief, and felt the words come as steady as the earth beneath them. "No, Annie Mae," he said. "I ain't leaving you, not now. Not ever." The trail stretched ahead, long and uncertain, but for once the cowboy didn't feel alone. He had someone to ride for, someone to keep Dot and as the hills rose. Up to meet them, He knew the promise he carried was not a chain, but a gift, one he would keep until his last day on earth.